Welcome to Beyond the Stethoscope. I am Arn Facklam, a nurse practitioner and fellow of hospital medicine. And this is where we explain what is really happening behind the scenes in healthcare in a way that actually makes sense. Today, we're talking about something that almost everyone has experienced, but very few people truly understand your hospital bill. And this is one of those topics that can trigger frustration almost instantly because people open that envelope or that online statement and what they see just doesn't feel right. The numbers feel too high, the charges feel unclear, and the whole thing feels disconnected from reality. And the truth is, that feeling is not wrong because what hospitals don't clearly tell you is that your bill is not a simple price. It is the visible output of a very complex financial system. That was never really designed for patients to understand. Let's pull back the curtain. When most people think about a bill, they think in very straightforward terms. You receive a service, there is a cost, you pay that cost. That is how most of the world works. But hospital billing does not follow that model. Instead, it starts with something called a charge master. The charge master is essentially a massive internal price list. Every medication, every lab test, and every IV fluid, and every piece of equipment, and every procedure, and each one has a line, and each line has a price. But here's the key point. Those prices are not designed to reflect what something actually costs to provide. They function more like a starting point, a very high starting point. You may have heard examples before. A single dose of a common medication billed at $20 or $30. A basic supply, they're marked up far beyond what you would ever expect in a routine service, carrying a price tag that feels shocking. Those examples sound extreme, but they exist because the charge master is not built for transparency. It is built for negotiation. And that brings us to the next layer, negotiated rates. If you have insurance, your insurance company does not simply accept the charge master price. Instead, long before you ever walk into the hospital, there are contracts in place, agreements between hospitals and insurance companies, and these agreements determine what will actually be paid for each service. So the hospital might list a service at $10,000, but the insurance company may have negotiated that down to $3,000. And from there, your specific insurance plan decides how that $3,000 is divided, what the insurance covers, what goes toward your deductible, what becomes your responsibility. And so now we have three different numbers: the hospital's listed charge, the negotiated rate, and what you personally owe. And here's where the confusion sets in because patients are usually shown the first number and the last number, but almost never given a clear explanation of everything that happened in between. So when someone looks at a bill and sees a massive charge followed by an insurance adjustment, and then still owes hundreds or thousands of dollars, it feels arbitrary. It feels inflated and it feels unfair. And without context, it is very hard to make sense of. And without context, it is very hard to make sense of it. Now, let's talk about one of the most frustrating parts of this system: surprise billing. This is where patients feel blindsided because they did everything they thought they were supposed to do. They went to a hospital that was in their insurance network and they followed instructions. They trusted the system. But what many people do not realize is that not every provider inside that hospital is necessarily in their network. The emergency physician might not be, the radiologist might not be, the anesthesiologist might not be, and patients usually do not get to choose those providers. In many cases, they may not even know those providers were involved. But later, separate bills appear, and those bills can be significantly higher because they are considered out of network. That disconnect between what patients expect and what actually happens is what made surprise billing such a major issue. And in response to that, laws were passed to protect patients from many of these situations, and those protections have helped. But the system itself is still complicated, still layered, still difficult to navigate, and still not well explained. Now, here is something that is rarely said out loud. Hospitals are not necessarily trying to confuse patients, but they are operating within a system that prioritizes contracts, and billing structures, and reimbursement processes over clarity. And so what patients receive is not an explanation, it is a statement, a summary of charges, adjustments, balances, without a clear narrative of how those numbers came to be. And that is where frustration grows, because when people do not understand something that affects them financially, they naturally question it. They should question it. And here is an important point. The first bill you receive is not always the final word. And sometimes there are coding errors. Sometimes there are duplicate charges. And sometimes services are billed in ways that can be reviewed or clarified. And sometimes there are assistance programs, payment plans, or review processes that patients are never told about. That does not mean every bill is wrong, but it does mean that patients have more room to ask questions than they often realize. And that matters because the real issue here is not just the money, it is the disconnect. Patients experience care in one way. They remember the nurse who helped them, the provider who explained things the moment they started to feel better. But the bill they receive later does not reflect that experience. It reflects a system built on billing codes, contractual rates, coverage rules, network designations, and financial relationships that are largely invisible during the actual care. So when patients say, "Oh, this doesn't make sense," they are often exactly right because they are trying to interpret a system that was never designed for them to clearly understand. And maybe that is the most important takeaway of what you see on your hospital bill is not just the cost of your care, it is the surface layer of a much larger hidden economy, an economy built on charge master pricing, negotiated contracts, insurance structures, and regulatory frameworks that have evolved over decades. So if your hospital bill has ever felt confusing or inflated or impossible to fully understand, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not wrong to question it because understanding this system, even at a basic level, can take something that feels overwhelming like and make it just a little more navigable. And that is what this is really about. Not outrage, not blame, but clarity. Because when you understand what is happening behind the scenes, you are no longer just reacting to the bill. You are reading it with context. And that changes everything.